From cosmic order to personal expression. What happened to Western music? Imagine for a moment you're a Greek philosopher. It's the 6th century BC, and after days of experimenting with different pitches and string lengths, you run out into the night sky and are struck by the realization that this music stuff could all be much, much bigger than expected. Hello and welcome, my name is Evan, and in this video we are going to be exploring music, the objective world, and the ancient conception of the music of the spheres. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned, let's get right into the video. So first of all, if I asked you right now, is music something objective, discoverable in nature, or subjective, something we create or construct? What would you say? And we're not just talking about musical motifs or melodies. We're talking about the very rules that transform random audible chaos into something intelligible, orderly, and coherent. Almost recognizable, mirroring not just another piece, but the very nature of reality itself. To answer this question, we will be breaking down the subject into two parts. First, how the ancients conceived of music, and how that led to the geniuses that later pioneered the field. Then second, how the new, modern understanding of music completely transformed, and how this new perspective's manifestation can be heard even in modern pop music. The ancient understanding. The idea of the music of the spheres originates in ancient Greece. It is initially a principle of Pythagoreanism and later gets developed by 16th century astronomer Johann Kepler. Now the phrase music of the spheres might sound almost mysterious or esoteric to modern ears. However, back in the day it provided a very real and tangible way of understanding reality. To break it down, imagine you're a physicist. You know that nature isn't random. Matter behaves according to mathematical laws. Crystals form according to geometric rules, planets orbit according to gravitational equations, and atoms have quantized energy levels. In other words, reality has an intrinsic and objective mathematical order. This is something we discover, not construct. Now consider sound. A vibrating string doesn't produce arbitrary random frequencies. It naturally produces ratios such as 2:1, 3:2, or 4:3, otherwise known as the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. Again, these aren't merely socially constructed inventions. If humanity vanished tomorrow and all the cultural frameworks and perceptions and even language disappeared, stretched strings would still generate the same harmonic series. Already, we're getting pretty close to what the ancients meant. The idea here is that music isn't simply something humans make up. Humans discover certain mathematical relationships already present in nature. Now back to Pythagoras experimenting with different string vibrations. What he found during this process is that pleasant intervals consistently correspond to simple numerical ratios, like the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. This seems almost obvious today, but imagine discovering that beauty can be mapped out and understood numerically, even if only at a basic level. This was revolutionary. Now, what does all this have to do with planets? This is where a lot of confusion arises. The ancients did not think that the planets literally emitted audible sounds that if we just listened hard enough we could somehow hear. Instead, the idea was that the same mathematical proportions that produce harmony in music also govern the universe and, by extension, the planets. So, looking at snowflakes, DNA, galaxies, and so on, all these share extraordinarily complex underlying mathematical structures. The deduction the ancients made was that music belonged to that list. Hence, some music is more musical than other music, not because it sings more or is more in line with the zeitgeist, but because it is proportioned. Just as one work of architecture is superior to another by virtue of being constructed in harmony with proportion and the laws of physics, rather than in defiance of them. Now, this is the world from which some of the greatest works of music ever written emerged. The Mass in B minor, or the St. Matthew's Passion, are frequently cited as among the highest achievements of musical development ever reached. To someone like Johann Sebastian Bach, music wasn't primarily self-expression. It wasn't therapy, and it certainly wasn't entertainment. Music was more like participation in this divine order, the same order that governs all of the universe. His fugues don't merely express emotion, they discover relationships. Themes unfold literally in a mathematical fashion. Now, with all this wonderful development, it would seem only natural to sit and marvel at what the music of the future might look like. The radical increase in musical complexity, fullness, and sheer scale seen in the Baroque period was simply unheard of compared to past times. However, this is where we introduce the second theory of art, which, although dominating modern culture, actually began to develop much earlier. Theory B, music as psychology. Art expresses the artist. Originality paramount, emotion sovereign, individuality supreme. These ideas are ones we're much more familiar with today. Here, success means this sounds like me, whereas success according to theory A is much closer to this reveals something true. Notice the difference. One points inward, the other outward. Beginning especially in the late 18th and 19th centuries, music becomes psychological. Emotion replaces proportion. Authenticity replaces participation in order. Now, it's important to note that this shift doesn't occur overnight. It's not like emotion was never part of music until Beethoven or Chopin came around. However, as time goes on, year by year, decade after decade, the goal of music subtly shifts. When considering composers such as Mozart or Beethoven, or even Bach's own sons, who likewise were composers, the rules and elements that socially define what a good piece of music is largely are still around, but rather to communicate the perception and sensation of the individual. In other words, the tools of communication remain, yet what they're trying to say slowly changes. Now the 20th century strikes. Mass media transforms music into industry, and attention becomes scarce. Music increasingly aims at immediate impact, novelty, emotional stimulation, and finally, market differentiation. The masses, hungry for emotional stimulation and what we call relatability, demand something that immediately satisfies their desire, no matter what it might be at the moment. The question, what can I get people to click on, dominates, prioritizing audience satisfaction. If done well, music gets rewarded enormously for a couple of weeks or months before disappearing into irrelevance again. What we seem to observe is that music with the sole aim of capturing today's emotional vocabulary inevitably ages with today's culture. And of course, it is important to note that Bach's music isn't merely mathematical. In fact, it's profoundly emotional. However, emotion is not the foundation upon which everything else is built in the same way it is today. In summary, the old cosmology, which once unified mathematics, ethics, and the structure of the universe with music, gradually gets replaced by personal expression, individual emotion, and later industrialization and mass media. Together with a surge in reductionist materialism, these categories altered not only how music was made, but also what people believe music is for. So perhaps the deepest change in Western music is not that composers simply stopped writing beautiful compositions. Rather, the goal of music changed. Western culture largely moved away from belief in an objective cosmic harmony for music to participate in, and with new aims such as strong market incentives for mass appeal, music naturally came to be understood as something more like entertainment. Modern compositions simply reflect that. Personally, I am of the opinion that even if one rejects its original cosmology, the music of the spheres still remains incredibly valuable. It invites a question not often asked anymore. Is music something we invent to express ourselves, or something we discover, because it reflects patterns of intelligibility already present in reality? Whether one answers as a materialist, a Platonist, or a theist, that question still prescribes how one hears Bach, and why, 3 centuries later, his music continues to feel less like some historical artifact than a conversation with something eternal.